I'm Todd Katzner. I'm the local representative. Come on in if you want to. There's plenty of seats. I'm the local representative of the scientific committee, and on behalf of all of us here, I'd like to welcome you to Charlotte and to the 2024 RRF conference. I'd like to thank RRF for agreeing to hold the conference here, the Carolina Raptor Center, for their exceptional efforts as the local host, and the scientific committee for their work in putting together the program and these plenary talks. So when the scientific committee and the Carolina Raptor Center were planning these plenaries, we decided we didn't want to simply put people with tons of experience in front of you and sort of randomly get people up here. Instead, we had a strategy. We wanted to make these plenaries sort of locally relevant. We wanted to tell a story about raptors that also highlighted features that were timely to raptor conservation, that related to the local southeastern environment, and that were relevant to the mission of our host, right? So we have speakers on black vultures, which are one of the biggest conservation issues in the Southeast, on avian influenza, which is obviously an emerging topic of great importance, and on an iconic species of eastern North America, including the North Carolina Highlands, the eastern golden eagle. So that is today's talk, and the plenary today is entitled Unraveling the Mysteries of the Eastern Golden Eagle, and just stay there. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Trish Miller. This one's a little personal for me because I know Trish well. So I'm going to start with a bit of background information and then tell you a brief story about Trish. And I promise I'm only going to talk for 35 minutes, giving her plenty of time to do her thing. Trish is a senior research wildlife biologist and executive director of Conservation Science Global, which is a nonprofit based in Cape May, New Jersey. She got her undergraduate degree from University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and her master's and PhD from Penn State. Her research focuses on movement ecology, habitat selection, and understanding conflicts between raptors and human activities, all in an effort to inform conservation and management. In addition to being a founding member of the Eastern Golden Eagle Working Group, Trish is a North American director at RRF and co-chair of RRF's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. So this is my last slide. Trish caught her first golden eagle at the Goshoots Mountain in 1998. This is not the Goshoot Mountains. Nor is it 1998. And she has been fascinated by golden eagles ever since. So when the opportunity to study this population presented itself, she jumped at the opportunity, she jumped at the chance, and she turned it into a PhD and a career, or part of a career. There's a lot more to it. For almost 20 years, she and others in the Eastern Golden Eagle Working Group have been studying this enigmatic population. For me, though, this is a story. This picture is a little iconic of what makes Trish and her research so special. This picture is from 2005, and Trish is holding a golden eagle, and that sounds pretty straightforward, but it's not actually. There's a couple of things to know about this picture. First, this is the first eagle that anyone caught for the research that Trish has led over the years. Other eagles had occasionally been caught in eastern North America, but nobody had actually gone out to target golden eagles and caught them. So this was the first one that was targeted. Those of you who are graduate students or undergraduate students or who have ever been a student will appreciate the fact that Trish was a truant when she captured this eagle. She skipped class because it was a good west wind day, and she wanted to get out there to get this bird. To make it more impressive, Trish is 5 months pregnant in this picture. And that context, that's not normally something I'd get up here and talk about, but there's a really cool context because her daughter, who's barely visible here, is now in college. And so that gives you an idea of the duration and the effort that Trish has put into this. And those years of effort have contributed to a remarkable span of research, publication, and conservation, for which Trish has really been the tip of the spear. So over the years, that has led to efforts to trap and tag more than 120 eagles, leading to more than 25 peer-reviewed publications and numerous technical reports. And all of this work has provided invaluable insights into the behavior and ecology of this special population. All of that information was the basis for the recently published Eastern Golden Eagle Conservation Plan, and it was actually key to a listing petition that was submitted about the same time as that conservation plan. So Trish has been essential to this research, and none of it would have happened without her hard work and leadership. And so there's no better person to give a plenary about this species and its ecology and conservation in North America. So Trish, why don't you come up here and do your thing?
All right, oops. So thanks so much for the introduction, Todd. That was really nice. First, I want to mention that it's a real bummer that Mike Jones couldn't be here to give this plenary. He's done some amazing work, and I would have really loved to have heard from him. I hope that we all can hear from him again at a future RF plenary. I also want to thank the local committee for recommending me to fill in for Mike. I feel extremely privileged to be up here right now to talk to you all about the work that's consumed my life and career for the last 19 years. I was pregnant when it started, and I did my best to balance both family and career. And quite honestly, so many of my memories of my family are so closely tied to memories of our golden eagle research and vice versa. The two can almost not be disentangled. And I couldn't have done this without the support of our research team or the support of my husband, Mike, and our family and so many others. But this work has not been done in a vacuum. This work could only be accomplished by a collaborative, and I must say that I think that we have one of the best species collaboratives in the Eastern Golden Eagle Working Group, some of whom are pictured here in Maine, but I could be a tiny bit biased there. I just wanted to give everybody a quick orientation to the different golden eagle populations in North America. There's the sedentary western population found throughout the western US, into Canada and Mexico, and there are also migratory populations in Western Canada and Alaska. And the eastern population is basically found from the mid-continent east. And when we started this project, there was a real question about how many golden eagles were actually in this population. At that time, back in 2005, everybody was saying somewhere around 1,000 individuals. But then, since then, Andrew Denhart, for his master's thesis, estimated the population to be probably somewhere more like 5,000 individuals. So golden eagles have been recorded at hawk watches since the first hawk watch was started at Hawk Mountain, and they've been recorded during winter in the east for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But for a very long time, people thought they were rare winter residents and even vagrants. And even to this day, some people still consider them to be rare, despite in places that we know as researchers that there's tons of golden eagles. So I saw my first golden eagle in the east when my husband and I went up to Tussey Mountain Hawk Watch in spring of 2001. This hawk watch has one of the highest counts of spring migrating goldens in the eastern US. And there we met two people that would have a lasting effect on our lives, Dave Brandis and Dan Umbalski. They started the Tussey Mountain Hawk Watch and got us thinking more and more about these birds, the ideas of these two hydrologists, they're not biologists, they're hydrologists, about how eagles move through the landscape like the ridges of Pennsylvania, which shape our questions, thoughts, and ideas about golden eagles. Then one day in early 2005, our boss said, "You guys want to study golden eagles?" We were at Powder Mill Nature Reserve in southwest PA. And he said, "There's this guy who just got hired at the National Aviary who studies eagles in Kazakhstan. You guys should meet him." And so we met him. And this was the birth of our project. When Todd came to town, all of our minds got together, and we started the project. But I think that more importantly was this. We met Aaron, his super cool coworker at the time. They weren't even a couple when they met. We met Aaron. So I think that the Golden Eagle project kind of brought them together as well. So we had this knowledge from watching at Tussey that eagles were migrating along the ridges of Pennsylvania. And at the same time, we knew that wind energy development was also starting along those ridges. From work that had been done in California, we knew that there were consequences for building turbines in areas where eagles were concentrated. So we took this knowledge and decided to study the migratory behavior of golden eagles in the Appalachians to better understand conflicts with wind energy. Ideally, we wanted to know how eagles were flying in response to topography and weather to help inform risk from turbines. But first, we needed funding. And so, like Todd had mentioned, the Pennsylvania Game Commission told us they were interested in giving us money to fund this project, but nobody had caught targeted adult golden eagles in Pennsylvania. So we were set to try to capture adults. And that's when I skipped class and caught this beauty when I was 6 months pregnant. 1 year later, we had funding in hand and also a little baby. Phoebe was 8 months old, and she got to spend time hanging out under the blind with us, and we had to make special blinds that we could put heaters in because it's very cold, and you don't want your little baby standing there in the freezing cold. Notice that Todd has a flip phone. I was wondering, where's his BlackBerry in this picture? So this would begin Phoebe's love-hate relationship with eagles. She loves birds, especially bald eagles, though. But she hates when we go away in the winter, which has pretty much been every single year since we started this project. But first, I want to take you back a little bit. So this was 2006. We had this mission to understand how eagles fly along ridges to address the concern from wind energy. But there was actually a small body of knowledge that we hoped to build on to unravel the mysteries of the eastern golden eagle population. So we knew that eagles had been documented nesting in the Northeast, in Maine, New Hampshire, and New York. At that time, Walter Spofford, who was one of the most knowledgeable people about nesting eagles in the region, unfortunately, he was super secretive and didn't like to share his nest locations. And actually, the bird in the picture on the right was banded, but I couldn't even find a banding record for that bird. There was a biologist in New York DEC named Singer. He documented 16 nests in the early 70s and as many as 13 individuals in the Adirondacks. But he noted that there was this fire suppression and lack of fire in the region had all but eliminated foraging habitat for goldens. And Spofford noted that the productivity of Appalachian eagles was very low, and also there was a decline in the fall flight, which bared resemblance to that of bald eagles, osprey, and peregrines. And Charlie Todd would later collect eggs from nests in Maine and do testing on those eggshells and determine that DDT was indeed a contributor to the decline and eventual extirpation of the species from the Northeast. Brian Millsap and Sandra Vanna described the winter distribution of golden eagles by looking through American bird journals and looking at the bald eagle winter surveys, and they indicated that the majority of the birds that were in these reports were associated with wetlands and other open areas. And they also described some of the first movements and from band recoveries, which kind of gave us a tiny bit of insight into where these wintering birds were coming from. And during surveys for Hydro-Quebec in western Quebec, Morneau et al. Documented about 20 nests near the Hudson Bay in western Quebec, which led to the first telemetry study tracking golden eagles using Argo satellite transmitters, which again gave us a little bit more information and detail about the movements of these eastern birds. And then finally, we had a glimpse of what eagles might be doing on the wintering grounds from info from Wisconsin and northern Illinois by the father of telemetry, Bill Cochran, and his trusty sidekick, Arlo Rabe. They attached VHF telemetry to an eagle caught at Cedar Point and followed it for about 2 months, and which is definitely no easy task. And one of the things they documented was feeding behavior, including feeding on carrion, but also prey attempts on things like ring-necked pheasants. But these studies all provided a base of scientific knowledge to build on, and also left lots of mysteries for us to understand. So back to our story and our quest to fill those knowledge gaps. In 2006, we trapped in Pennsylvania, and then in 2007, in West Virginia. I meant 2008. We continued tracking birds in 2009. Jeff Cooper started trapping in Virginia, and Mark Martell and Scott Mayhew started trapping in Wisconsin. In 2010, our daughter Willow was born 3 weeks after I took my PhD comps. You can do this. Craig Copey started trapping in Maryland in 2012, and we went to Argentina. We went to Argentina for the RRF conference in 2013, and we also started working with wildlife agencies in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama. In 2014, Tom Salo and his crew in New York started trapping in New York, and we continued, and Mark and Scott also did some trapping in Minnesota, and we continued building our data set. 2018, we went to RRF in Africa, which was awesome, and did I miss it? We also started trapping in Georgia. And our data set continued to build, and we started filling in information for other states. And in 2022, we finally started trapping in the Ozarks, which I had wanted to trap in for a long time with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so over this time period, not only did our kids grow, but so did the Eastern Golden Eagle Working Group and our data set, and with it, our body of knowledge on this population. So our original question was to understand risk eagle space from wind energy. And in order to do that, you have to have an understanding of their flight behavior. These are actually, this is not Pennsylvania, it's Altamont Pass, but it's the only photo I have, or video I have of birds flying near wind turbines. So just a quick primer. A lot of you know this, I'm sorry. But for those of you that don't, there are a couple different kinds of flight. There's powered flight, and then there's subsidized flight. So subsidized flight that eagles use are thermal soaring and gliding, and also orographic soaring. So thermal soaring occurs when the air is heated by the ground and the Earth's surface and starts rising, and birds circle up, and they glide off to the next thermal. Another mode of subsidized flight, which is what Dave and Brandis and Dan Ambalski were describing, was orographic soaring or slope soaring, which is when winds are deflected by topography and deflected upwards, which provides updrafts that eagles can use. And this is what makes the Ridge and Valley region of the Appalachians a type of superhighway for migrating raptors, and it's also what makes it a good place for wind energy development. So we first started tagging eagles with Argo GPS units in 2006, which is represented here by these black triangles. The points are about an hour apart. And we soon realized that this meant we could only get a few flight points each day during migration. And if we wanted to understand flight behavior, we needed more data. We needed better technology than what existed. And if we couldn't get to that, we'd have to change our questions. So despite talking to all these different telemetry companies that existed at the time, none of them would help us. So I don't know, some of you know Mike, and typical of Mike, he said, I'll just make a transmitter that does it. And he did. And I think there's a lot of people in this room who may have benefited from that. I know I did. So he invented these GSM, GPS transmitters that could collect over 200 times the amount of data because they could send that amount of data. Satellite units are kind of they can only send a certain amount because of the communication structure. So these new cellular units were the key to us understanding how the influence of topography and weather on flight. And so in this map, we could see not only where the birds were going, but how they could get there. So indeed, back then, we could identify a thermal soaring and gliding track from the 30-second data based on the L shape of the track and the distance between points. And if there was any sort of wind, you could see a thermal drifting. And that's why you get that L shape. So birds rise up, thermal drifts, and you see that represented in the telemetry data. Now we can get up to 1-second resolution on tracks and see exactly how many circles an eagle makes in a thermal, measure the thermal depth, and measure the strength and so much more, like Garstang et al. Did in 2022. We can also see orographic soaring as illustrated here, where an eagle is flying along the west slope of a ridge, catching updrafts. So starting in 2009, we began collecting these high-resolution data within a geofence of Pennsylvania, which is our study area. And we also we're concerned about battery levels and things like that, so we limited where we were working. And one of the first publications to come out of those data was linking flight altitude to landform over which eagles fly. So we knew that turbines were typically built atop ridges, and that risk would be linked to how high they were flying. And so here you can see that when eagles are flying above summits where turbines would be built, they would be flying within that rotor swept zone. We then linked flight behavior to wind speed. Here you can see the left panel, that height band, which is the difference between the minimum and maximum flight altitude over a certain time period. Height band changes as wind speed changes less as wind speed increases. And in the right panel, you can see that flight altitude is lower when height band changes less. So this means that when wind speeds are higher, eagles are using orographic soaring. Now, most of us who watch birds at hawk watches, we know this. But if you want to look at broad spatial scales to estimate risk from turbines, you need data that cover a broad spatial scale. So this is one of the things that the telemetry gave us. It gave us insights into patterns of flight behavior beyond a few locations like hawk watches. So these linkages set up the hypotheses that flight altitude response is indicative of changing of behavior by eagles. That is, they're switching from use of thermal to orographic updrafts and vice versa. So when eagles use these subsidized flight modes, they're reducing the energetic cost of flight. And we think that the preferred mode of flight is thermal soaring because it's faster, especially when thermals are strong. So even though they have to circle up in a thermal and then glide off and stop and slow down, that it is faster because they can make great cover great distances during the glides. So if you look at the top graph, you can see that over the same time period, indicated by the spacing of those 30-second GPS points, eagles fly further when they are soaring and gliding than when using orographic updrafts. But thermals are not always available. So eagles need to switch to orographic soaring if they can. So that is if the topography can support orographic soaring. So eagles benefit by flying along the Appalachians if the weather changes, because they have two types of subsidized flight that they can use to keep migrating. And this is probably the reason also why we see so many eagles wintering in areas with relatively high topographic relief. If they're in flatter areas, they can only use thermal soaring as a type of subsidized flight. If thermals aren't available, then they either have to use powered flight or they have to stop flying. So conditions that influence thermal development differ between spring and fall. So these graphs show the conditions when the different age classes, juveniles, subadults, and adults, were migrating during spring migration and fall migration. So best lifted index is an indicator of atmospheric stability. And a stable atmosphere with high best lifted index, thermal development is suppressed. So we found that best lifted index was higher in fall, meaning that thermals were more suppressed. And we also found that downward shortwave radiation flux, a measure of heating of the Earth's surface, is also lower during fall than spring migration. And interestingly, you can see that adults migrate at a time when thermal updrafts are less available in spring compared to younger birds. And we also found that eagles are affected by weather at the individual scale. Here you can see that birds actively, when they decide to migrate, they're selecting conditions that support thermal development, which is needed for soaring flight to reduce the cost of the cost of migration. So it's particularly evident during mid-spring migration and late spring migration. But age is also an important predictor of departure date during spring migration. You can see here, spring migration is staggered by age class and fall is not. So departure date on the y-axis and age on the x-axis. And it's starting, yeah. So adults will improve their fitness by arriving earlier on the breeding grounds. They're represented here in blue, but not too early. So you can see a mass exodus of the adults up to the breeding grounds, followed by the subadults, and then those juveniles are hanging back and waiting. So the younger birds are likely benefit from waiting to migrate to reduce those energetic costs. And we can indeed see in the telemetry data that they're using thermals more than the adults are. In the fall, you just see a mass exodus of all of them at the same time. So not only do conditions affect timing and when eagles choose to migrate, but the different conditions also affect flight behavior. When we examined different flight behaviors, we found that the proportion of time in these behaviors differed between seasons. Eagles used more orographic soaring in the fall, but thermal soaring was essentially the same between seasons. However, note that gliding is lower in spring, or lower in fall than spring. So why might that occur? This occurs because thermals are weaker in fall and stronger in spring. So when thermals are stronger, they reach higher altitudes, and then they're spaced further apart, which allows eagles to glide for longer distances. And when they're shorter, they're closer together, and the glides are much shorter as well. So that means that cross-country speeds in spring are going to be much faster than cross-country speeds in fall. So these differences in behavior and weather ultimately influence how eagles fly during the different seasons, and also influence their risk. So during fall and winter, they're flying at much lower flight altitudes than they are during spring. And these conditions also influence where they're flying, and that's reflected in what is seen at hawk watches. During March, migration is concentrated in the ridge and valley, so you can see that as in the red lines. During April and May, it's much more dispersed. And this dispersed migration isn't only because of weather, but it's also because of age and learning. Those young kids are using thermals, but they also haven't realized that those lakes are to the north. But they're going to remember that next year, and then they're going to start using the Appalachians and curving up and missing the lakes. So getting back to what started this whole project, we were able to use some of this knowledge that we gained to better understand risk to eagles from wind energy. And our first application was to identify high-risk areas from wind energy development in the Central Appalachians. And we have since used this approach in different areas of the East, as well as different seasons. We've done several models for Jeff Cooper for Virginia during winter, and we're also applying it to bald eagles and golden eagles in the West. These models also allow us to identify how the different risk levels of individual turbines, and thus how risk varies among facilities and regions. So you can see here that the Allegheny Mountains have the lower risk turbines compared to the Ridge and Valley, that superhighway, or the Northern Plateaus region. And to link risk to individual turbines, like we can see here, the high-risk turbines are the ones in orange. And we could use this model to suggest siting modifications to reduce risk to eagles. And this is that framework that we developed to use elsewhere. So a big gap in the knowledge when we started this project has everything to do with winter. What the heck was going on during winter? We knew next to nothing about their distribution, what types of areas they were using. Pretty much, you could see eagles flying by hawkwatch, and then once they went by the hawkwatches and migration ended, they disappeared. So where were they going? Our early telemetry data kind of started to give us some insight into this. So this map shows the movements of a golden eagle over the course of a single day. The points are 30 seconds apart, and you can see here that this eagle was almost exclusively using heavily forested areas, which is where people rarely are, especially during the winter, which means that golden eagles were often hiding in plain sight. And we indeed found that when we did a home range analysis and looked at cover types within those home ranges, they were heavily forested with only about 20% open cover. We also found that these home ranges were located in areas with high topographic relief, as illustrated by the proportion of slope within the home ranges. When we looked at forest structure derived from LIDAR data and how that influenced selection in the New Jersey pinelands, we found that eagles were selecting areas with lower bulk canopy density, especially with respect to the understory. So you can see here in the violin plots showing CBD, canopy bulk density, measured at different canopy heights for the GPS points versus available points. You can see that golden eagles favored a more open understory, that is, and was lower canopy bulk density, both when perched and in flight. And this preference for an open understory was significant at less than 6 meters height throughout the canopy. These results supported our hypothesis that an open understory would be preferred because it facilitates visual observation of prey, and also helps inform management to suggest that keeping an open understory through fire or other means would be beneficial to golden eagles. Also, when we began this project, the distribution of the eastern population was poorly described by range maps. So this is from the BNA, or Birds of North America count, now Birds of the World, back in 2002. And if you looked at this map, you'd say, I'm never going to see a golden eagle in the east. So in 2012, we tried to improve that perception in our status paper that was published. And this map was based on our knowledge at that time, based on ecoregion boundaries, our telemetry data, and incorporation of MILSAP and VANA's data. The 2020 Birds of the World account was a bit better than the previous version, but it is missing some of the most important wintering habitat for golden eagles, the Appalachian Mountains. Apparently, they only migrate there. So, not to mention the breeding areas across Nunavut, Manitoba, Quebec, and Labrador. Now, our names are on this paper, but we really didn't have any input into that map. So to get a better idea of the empirical distribution, I reviewed literature, community science reports, telemetry data, Christmas bird count data, and documented what the county level distribution of golden eagles during the winter. And you can see that what you can see is that they really occupy a very large portion of the eastern U.S., much larger than anyone thought 19 years ago. And Jenny McCabe also estimated the relative probability of occurrence by month. You can see here how the Appalachian Mountains have a very high probability of occurrence of golden eagles during January, as does the Ozark Mountains. Now, what drives these distributions is resources, and this, to Todd's chagrin, may be one of the more important food sources for eagles in the east. And although our friends in Minnesota were successful using domestic turkeys as prey to catch eagles, we found that it was much easier and less time-consuming to use carrion. And sites like this were not uncommon almost anywhere we trapped. We have multiple birds, 6, 7 in some cases. And these camera trap sites also allowed us to trap pretty much anywhere. We could talk to somebody, say, put out a carcass, put a camera on it, and if eagles show up, we can go trap there. They also allowed us to collaborate and connect with folks, especially these state wildlife management personnel on the ground, and also develop a very large camera trapping network. So we had over 200 collaborators and 250 camera traps distributed throughout the East. And this insight and our success luring eagles to bait led to us being able to document the wintering distribution of these birds. So we gathered millions of photographs from camera traps, and Dave Jakowski was able to estimate detection rates, and of course the highest rates of detection were where? That's right, in the Appalachians. So we also looked at age segregation of age classes. In some migratory species, it's been documented that sexes or age classes segregate. These graphs show that show latitude on the x-axis and daily and seasonal rates of detection of the different age classes. And essentially what you can see here is that there was no relationship between age and latitude in the Appalachians. So these camera traps can provide a lot of information on distribution, but they can also be quite entertaining. So take this young girl for instance. She really showed off for the camera. It's like, look at my big crop. I think that we can safely call her America's Next Top Model. We also captured many interesting interactions and behaviors like this one, where a female, she actually has a tag on, appears to be placing a branch on a carcass, much like a bobcat might do to hide that carcass. I don't know if that's what she's trying to do. Who knows? And if you have video, you can see some really cool interactions like this. This was taken in Arkansas, believe it or not, and we had about 9 eagles and this little guy making a sneak attack. You'll never see me. So this is in a state where the eBird coordinator says, what? Golden eagles aren't here. They're only very rare vagrants. And we had 3 trapping sites within about 5 miles of each other and had at least 9 different eagles documented here. So now Mike and Jeff Cooper and I have spent, I said hundreds yesterday, and Mike's like, no, it's thousands. We've been trapping every winter for 19, or probably 17 years. But we've been able to sit in the blind and watch and listen to eagles. And one thing that we noticed at almost all of our sites is that some birds appear to be paired and engaging in some kind of pair-bonded behavior, like these 2 birds in Kentucky. Now, we've tried in vain for many years to catch birds of a pair, like for 15 years. And we got really close one time at Freedom Hills in northwest Alabama, just a few miles from the Mississippi border. But damn, if she didn't lift her wings and he snuck out. So we caught this female, we call her Natchez because this trap site is near the Natchez Trace. We've actually been tracking her since 2015. I'm just waiting for her to come home this year. So no one thought that when we started trapping here in northwest Alabama that we'd even get eagles, let alone how many we've gotten here. So we got a lot of crappy photos of eagles sitting together and some audio of eagles talking to one another. This is some of the pair-bonded behaviors we observed, including allopreening. I will say that when we caught that female and that male sat on the edge of the field and was watching us get her out of the net, and when we released her, he was still sitting on the other side of the tree line, and they started calling back and forth to one another. So we thought there was something going on. We didn't know if they were cheating on their mates or doing something else. So in 2018, we captured a male at Bernheim Forest in Kentucky, and 2 years later, we captured a female that we thought could possibly be his mate. And they left at the same time from Bernheim, but he went toward Duluth, and she went toward the Mackinac Straits. Damn, I mean, we were like, shit, sorry. But then when they headed south and dumped all their summer data, we saw this. They were indeed a breeding pair. They were breeding in Wapusk National Park, just outside of Churchill, Manitoba, where we hope to have our next Eastern Golden Eagle Working Group meeting. And this is a place where breeding was only first documented in 2011. And so they appear to spend time apart during migration. I'm assuming she just needs a break or something. But I can't begin to tell you how excited we were about this. I mean, we still have an N of 1, but hopefully someday we'll get another pair. So what's really cool about this story is that Andrew Berry, our collaborator at Bernheim Forest in Kentucky, reached out to the folks in Wapusk National Park. And last winter, they found her nest, and they flew over it in June and got this shot of her. She's probably incubating or on a small chick. Then they went back at the end of July and got this shot. And for those of you that study eagles or other species on the breeding grounds, this might not be a big deal, but for us on the wintering grounds, we never get to see their nests. It was amazing. And after 19 years of studying these birds, I finally got to see one of their nests. And I used to dream about what they might look like looking at aerial imagery. So I may not get to see a lot of eagle nests in person, but our collaborators in Quebec have documented a slew of nests, and those data And there in our telemetry data were recently used by Lori Maynard to characterize resource selection across different scales. Here you can see maps of relative probability of selection at the landscape scale, at foraging and nesting, and all three combined. And what you can see is it looks like Labrador is highly favored. So if we looked at some of the detail, Lori found that nests in Quebec and Labrador were situated at lower relative elevations than the surrounding landscape. This is essentially what Carol McIntyre sees in Denali. They're also foraging and nesting in areas with higher terrain ruggedness, and nesting more often on west-facing slopes in areas with lower forest cover. So when I compiled that wintering distribution, I got to read a whole bunch of accounts in the literature, and I got really interested in breeding reports. And I told you about the breeding in the Northeast. The last nesting pair were on territory in the late 90s, and the last chick was produced in the mid-80s. And outside of the Northeast, there were only 3 confirmed historic nests. I'd known for a while about the Pennsylvania nests, but I did learn about the Tennessee and Wisconsin nests. So despite the fact that golden eagles rarely bred outside of the Northeast, some well-intentioned people decided that they should reintroduce goldens into the Appalachians. So from the 1980s through the mid-2000s, eagles were released in a couple in Pennsylvania and more in Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, which resulted in these increased observations in summer in those regions. And these introductions led to breeding in Georgia and Tennessee, and possibly Virginia. In 2012, recently fledged eagle was found in Tennessee, and it died later in rehab. Then in 2015, a very young eagle was found in early August in Virginia. It was rehabbed. We released it with a transmitter. And the isotope data and other evidence strongly suggest that it came from somewhere near where it was found. Unfortunately, it disappeared after about 6 months. And since that time, no young eagles or nests have been found. So this brings us to our final story, and it has everything to do with genetics. Maria Wheeler did a study for her dissertation to look at genetic differentiation between eastern and western goldens. And her conclusions were that there was little genetic differences between either the historic populations, those populations prior to these introductions, or the contemporary populations. A more recent analysis by Jackie Doyle indicated that there is evidence for population differentiation. SNP data provided a snapshot of population genetic structure in North America and provided evidence for this population differentiation. And the pairwise FST analysis that she conducted showed that there was significant population differentiation was evident in Alaska versus eastern eagles, as well as Alaska versus western and eastern versus western. So why these conflicting studies? One of the conclusions that Maria had was there might be mixing of the populations. And we have long thought that if mixing was going to occur, it would be on the western margin of the eastern wintering area. As I was putting this presentation together, it dawned on me that there's one big difference between these two studies: the location of the samples. Notice that Jackie's samples did not include any birds from Minnesota. Maria's samples from Minnesota, could they be from western birds? If we look at our telemetry data, they indeed support this. The 100-degree latitude line indicates what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is used to classify east versus west. But as you can see here, and as I think the genetic data may support, we have both western and eastern birds wintering together in the western part of the eastern range. I think that's pretty cool, and it also has profound management implications. So I've talked a lot about the biology and behavior of these birds, and those have direct conservation consequences. And eagles also face at least a couple of threats because they feed on carrion. One of the problems that we identified very early on was incidental capture in mammal traps set on or near carrion. As a matter of fact, we've had at least 4 of our tagged eagles killed in traps and others caught or injured. These 3 bald eagles were found because we had a golden eagle that wasn't moving a lot, was in the same area, and when the folks from Quebec went to look for our eagle, they found these 3 dead bald eagles. It's a problem for both species. And the problem is illustrated here in Quebec, where the gray lines show our telemetry tracks and the stars indicate where 69 eagles have been caught in traps. This is the same region where our telemetry birds have been killed. Luckily, Quebec has undertaken efforts to educate trappers to reduce bycatch, and we need to be doing that here in the US as well, because the same things are happening here. We've had multiple birds caught in traps that we've tagged, and even one that was tagged that was caught in Michigan in a trap. Luckily, she wasn't hurt and was released. The other major problem eagles face here and everywhere from eating carrion is incidental ingestion of lead from ammunition. Below the red line, blood lead levels may be considered background levels, and above that, exposure. We take blood samples for every bird we catch, and we have them tested for lead. And you can see that all eagles that we've captured have some level of exposure. So Vince Sleeby was able to use our samples and samples from many other people in this room, as well as others, to show that golden eagle populations are suppressed by 1% annually. While this is disturbing, it's important to note that most hunters don't have any idea this is happening, and so education is a big part of this. But we are also, we've taken a role to provide information and also to provide free non-lead ammo. So this is a program that Vince runs, and we have a program in New York that would not have been possible without all the relationships that we've formed through capturing and tagging eagles and working with people on the ground. And we're excited that we're also going to be implementing an upcoming program in Georgia. So at our 2019 meeting of the Eastern Golden Eagle Working Group, we began working on the conservation plan that Todd mentioned. And in late 2023, we finally published that plan. It was a culmination of a lot of hard work and herding of 43 cats to get this done. Todd did all the herding. I am really proud to have been a part of this group and to have gotten to spend the last 19 years of my life studying these birds. We've learned so much about the population, but still, every time we go out in the field or put another unit on a new bird, we learn just a little bit more. So I need to thank my advisor, Dr. Rob Brooks. He was my advisor for my master's, and then when I said to Rob, I want to do a PhD on Goldens, he said, okay. He wholeheartedly took me on in 2007, and even though he was a wetlands ecologist, he wasn't an ornithologist, but he liked birds. But Rob was extremely special. He supported me throughout my master's when I had Phoebe in 2006, and again when I had Willow in 2010 during my PhD. And for any of us to make it in the field, we need people like Rob to support us along the way. So this project was not a project of 2 or 3 people. It's taken dozens and dozens of people to make it what it is today. And I think Goldens do a really great job putting things together, or bringing people together. And I know there's people missing from this, this slide, but it's impossible for me to get everybody on here. I do want to point out that we just started a project this year in Maine to look at, we're using camera traps, and we're hoping to tag some birds this winter, and hopefully eventually find eagles breeding in Maine again. So I've seen this project as my golden opportunity. I feel very lucky to have been a part of it. And I want to thank all of you for listening.
I think we probably have a few minutes for questions. The break is sort of starting in a minute or two, and
now there was one, I don't remember what year it was, but it's fairly probably within the last 10 years, at least one that was found dead, and all those were confirmed by the Florida Ornithological Society, whoever does the records there. So they're probably rare, and actually one time Mike and I were driving to Florida and we saw one in the median on 95, right? Anybody else? All right. Thank you.